The mob came up Main Street toward the jailhouse at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night in the autumn of 1887, with 31 men in it, and 3 lit pine torches, and the close, hot smell of whiskey carried in front of them on the cold air, and Caleb Westrick was already standing on the top step of the jailhouse with his rifle held muzzle down at his side and one hand resting on the wooden rail, because he had known since the moment Drum Crale had walked out of the saloon at 8:30 that he was going to be standing on this step before the night was over. He saw them when they were still 2 blocks away, the lit torches making a small moving smear of orange against the dark wooden facades of the buildings on either side of the street, and he had time, before they reached him, to do 3 things. The first was to look back over his shoulder through the open jailhouse door at his deputy Vrenna, who was sitting on the wooden bench inside the front office with her hat in her lap and her bright, vivid green hands folded over the brim, and who had agreed without argument 40 minutes earlier when Caleb had asked her to come into the cells for her own protection, and who had then refused at the cell door and had instead sat down on the bench in the front office with her badge still pinned to the leather of her vest and her rifle across her knees. He had not pushed her into the cell. He had not had the heart for it. He had said, "All right," and had turned and gone outside. The second was to look down at his own hands, which were not shaking, and to register this with the small, flat satisfaction of a man who had been wondering whether they would. The third was to think about his wife Margaret, who had been dead for 8 years that October, and who had known him as the kind of man who did this kind of work, and who had told him once, in the 2nd year of their marriage, when he had come home with a black eye from a saloon dispute he had broken up alone, "Caleb, you are going to be standing in a doorway one night with men who hate you on the other side of it, and the only thing that is going to matter on that night is whether you can remember what every one of them needed from you in the year before." He had remembered. He had been thinking about her words off and on all evening. He had 15 names in his head when the mob reached the foot of the wooden steps and stopped. He was 64 years old that autumn, and he had been the sheriff of the town of Cold Iron for 19 of those years. He had been born 64 years before, in a riverbank settlement 400 miles east, the son of a Welsh miner and a Welsh midwife who had crossed together in the second wave after the Great Hunger and had buried 2 children before they had carried Caleb to the New World in his mother's arms. He had taken a deputy's commission from a territorial marshal at 22 for the simple reason that the marshal had paid in gold while the mine paid in scrip, and he had been wearing some kind of badge ever since. He had married Margaret at 36, late by frontier standards. She had been the daughter of a freight hauler who had come through the territorial capital one summer with a string of mules and a copy of the Welsh Bible Margaret had read aloud at the small hotel where she had taken work, and Caleb had heard her reading through an open window from the boardwalk outside and had stopped on his beat to listen, and he had returned every evening that summer at the same hour to listen, and he had spoken to her on the 18th evening, and he had married her that autumn. They had not had children. Margaret had wanted them and had not been given them. She had been the kind of woman who turned the absence of a thing into the presence of something else, and the something else in her case had been the network of small daily attentions she paid to the lives of the people of Cold Iron, which she came to know by name and by trouble and by small need, and which by the time of her death 7 years after they had taken the post in this town, had made her better known and better loved in Cold Iron than her husband. Caleb had buried her on a clear, cold morning in October of 1879. He had reopened the sheriff's office the day after the funeral. He had not remarried. He had a small wooden house behind the jailhouse, which Margaret had painted dark blue herself the second year of their marriage, and he kept the paint touched up now in the same dark blue every autumn. He had a horse named Walker, who was getting old. He had Vrenna. She had come to him 6 years before, in the autumn of 1881, riding alone up the wagon road from the south on a tall bay gelding, with a wide-brimmed gray felt hat pulled low against the sun and a worn brown leather coat, buttoned to the throat against the cold, and a long-barreled rifle in a saddle scabbard and a small carved wooden token on a leather cord around her neck, which Caleb had not asked about until much later. She had stopped her horse at the hitching rail in front of the sheriff's office and dismounted and tied the gelding without hurrying. She had walked into the front office with the easy economy of a person who had been on a horse for a great many days, and had come up to his desk and had said, in the public tongue, "Sheriff, my name is Vrenna of the Highstone clan, and I was a tracker for the 3rd Territorial Militia in the Eastern campaigns. And I have heard from a man on the road that you are short a deputy, and I would like to apply for the post." Caleb had looked at her for a long moment over the desk. She was a tall Orc woman of perhaps 33 years, with bright, vivid green skin the color of the inside of a young birch leaf, and long black hair tied back in a single thick braid, and the regular slim build of an adult human female, and dark, steady eyes that did not flinch when he looked at them. She had 2 small lower tusks and the prominent pointed ears of her people. She had a fresh, thin scar across the bridge of her nose that he did not yet know the story of. She had taken her hat off when she came inside. She had held it in her left hand. She had stood very straight. He had said, "Vrenna, sit down." He had asked her 3 questions, and she had answered all 3 of them. And at the end of the 3rd answer, he had reached into his desk drawer and had taken out the deputy's star, which he had been carrying loose in the drawer for 4 months, since his last deputy had quit on him, and he had held it across the desk, and she had taken it, and she had said, "Sheriff, I will not let you down." He had said, "Vrenna, I am not worried about whether you will let me down. I am worried about whether the people of Cold Iron will let you down." She had nodded once. He had said, "I will back you." She had said, "I know, Sheriff. That is why I rode here." She had been his deputy for 6 years that October. She had handled, in those 6 years, a great many of the small daily kinds of trouble a frontier mining town threw at its sheriff's office: the saloon disputes, the petty thefts, the stray cattle, the missing children, the wagon wheel arguments. She had handled also 2 large kinds of trouble. The first had been a man named Earl Hollander, who had been beating his wife and his 8-year-old son with a length of harness leather, and whom Vrenna had walked into the saloon and had stood in front of and had told, in her steady, deep voice, that he would be coming with her now, and who had drawn a knife on her, and whom she had disarmed with a movement so fast that the witnesses afterward had not been entirely sure what they had seen, and whom she had walked back to the jailhouse with one hand on the back of his neck and the other on her own pistol grip, in the holster at her hip. The second had been a search for the lost daughter of the blacksmith Hollis Brand, An 8-year-old girl named Maureen, who had wandered into the woods west of the town in the second week of December the previous winter, and who would have been dead in 12 hours of cold if Vrenna had not tracked her 4 miles up a dry creek bed in the falling snow on the strength of a single broken twig at the edge of the timber, and had carried her back the 4 miles in the dark with the child wrapped inside her own coat. Hollis Brand had walked into the jailhouse the next morning with his hat in his hands, and had stood in front of Vrenna's desk, and had not been able to speak for almost a full minute. He had finally said, "Deputy," he had said, "anything you ever ask of me." He had walked out. There had been other things. Caleb had stopped counting them around the 3rd year. He had understood by the end of the 3rd year that Vrenna was not just a deputy he had hired in a difficult moment, but a person the town of Cold Iron was now going to have to decide whether it was the kind of town that kept her or not. And he had also understood that he was the person whose job it was going to be to make sure they decided to keep her every day by means of small, specific acts of good work. He had been doing that work for 6 years. He had thought often that he was getting tired. He had thought, less often but with growing conviction, that he was going to die in this office, and that this would be all right with him. Lonnie Crale had drawn on her at the corner of Main and Silver at 7:30 that evening. Caleb had not been there to see it. Vrenna had been making her usual evening round of the saloons, looking in at each one to see if anything was developing that would need to be quieted before it grew loud, and she had stopped at the door of the Silver Bell because there had been the particular kind of raised voices coming out of it that an experienced peace officer could identify from the boardwalk as a fight that had not yet started but was going to. She had walked in. She had found Lonnie Crale at the bar with a 10-inch buck knife in his hand and a man named Holbein bleeding from a long, shallow cut across the back of his right forearm. Holbein had been holding his bleeding arm with his other hand and had been backed against the wall, and Lonnie had been swaying on his feet with the slow, heavy sway of a young man who had been drinking since 2 in the afternoon, and the rest of the saloon had been very quiet. Vrenna had walked up to a careful distance from Lonnie and had said, in her steady voice, "Lonnie, set the knife on the bar." Lonnie had looked at her. He had been 27 years old that night, and the only living son of Drum Crale, who owned the largest of the 3 silver mines that the town of Cold Iron had grown up around, and he had been raised in the unconcealed expectation that whatever he did in the town, his father would smooth over with money and influence afterward. He had grinned at Vrenna. He had said something that the witnesses were unable to repeat to Caleb afterward without their voices going strange. He had set the buck knife down on the bar. He had reached very deliberately with his right hand toward the heavy revolver at his hip, and he had drawn it. He had not gotten it up. Vrenna had drawn her own pistol from the holster at her right hip in the same fluid movement, and she had fired 1 shot, and Lonnie Crale had fallen against the bar with the back of his head striking the brass rail, and he had been dead before the witnesses had stopped flinching. The bartender, a man named Pell, had set down the glass he had been polishing very carefully on the back counter. The man Holbein had said, in a small flat voice, she did not have a choice. There had been 3 other witnesses in the saloon who had said the same thing in their various words when Caleb had come over from the jailhouse 5 minutes later in response to the bartender's runner and had taken Vrenna's pistol from her hand and had told her gently to come back to the jailhouse with him. he had not arrested her. He had asked her to come, for the look of the thing, and because he had understood from the moment he had walked into the saloon and had seen Lonnie Crale on the floor that the night was about to require a great deal more careful work than a normal Saturday night required of him. They had walked back together. Caleb had taken statements from the witnesses, one at a time, in the front office of the jailhouse, while Vrenna had sat on the wooden bench against the wall with her hands folded in her lap and her hat on the bench beside her. He had finished the statements at 8:30. He had heard, from the boardwalk outside through the closed door of the jailhouse, the unmistakable change in the timbre of the voices that meant the news had reached the saloons that supplied Drum Crale with his evening companions. He had walked to the front window and had looked out, and he had seen Drum Crale come out of the Silver Bell at 8:30 with 7 men behind him and walk south down Main Street toward the corner of Silver where he himself owned a building, and he had understood. He had walked back to Vrenna and said, "Deputy, I would like you to come into the back cells with me for the next hour or two." Vrenna had said, "Sheriff, no." She had said, with all due respect, she had said, "If I am going to die tonight in this jailhouse, it is not going to be in a cell." Caleb had looked at her. He had said, "Vrenna." She had said, "Sheriff, please." He had nodded once. He had said, "Sit on the bench." She had sat. He had taken his rifle off the rack. He had checked the load. He had walked to the front step and gone outside and stood at the top of it and waited. And he had begun, while he waited, to think about the names. They came up to the foot of the steps. Drum Crale stopped 4 feet from the bottom step, with the front rank of his men close behind him, and the rest of the mob spread out in a loose half-moon across the muddy street and the boardwalks of the buildings opposite. The torches were 3. The rifles Caleb counted from the step were 11. The other men carried clubs, axe handles, lengths of pipe, and 4 lariats, 2 of which Caleb could see clearly from where he stood. Drum Crale was a heavy-shouldered man of 55, with a thick brown beard now going gray at the corners of the mouth, and small, hard blue eyes, which were red at the rims that night from grief and from whiskey. He wore a long, dark wool coat with brass buttons and a wide-brimmed dark felt hat and a heavy revolver at his right hip, and his hands were empty and at his sides. He looked up at Caleb on the step. He said, in a voice that was thick but steady, "Sheriff Westrick." Caleb said, "Drum." There was a long moment. Drum Crale said, "My son is dead." Caleb said, "Drum, I am sorry. I am very sorry." Drum Crale said, "The green woman in your jailhouse killed him." Caleb said, "My deputy killed him." "Yes." Drum Crale said, "Sheriff, I am here for her." He said, "You are going to step aside off that doorway, Sheriff, and I am going to walk into your jailhouse and take her out, and we are going to walk her down to the elm tree at the foot of Silver Street, and the matter is going to be finished tonight." He said, "You are not going to stand in front of me, Sheriff. You are going to step aside." Caleb did not move. He looked down at Drum Crale, and then he looked past him at the mob in the street, and he took a slow breath. He said, in a voice not raised much above the voice of a normal conversation, but in the cold air carrying clearly to the back of the mob, "No," he said. "My deputy is in the office behind me. She is the deputy of this town. She is wearing the badge I put on her 6 years ago. She has not been charged with a crime. She is not going to be charged with a crime tonight. There were 3 other witnesses in that saloon, and every one of them told me the same thing, which is that your son drew on her first drum, and she fired 1 shot in the lawful defense of her own life. And that is what the territorial court is going to find when this matter goes to court next month, which it is going to do, and at which I am going to give my evidence, and so are the witnesses, and so are you, Drum, if you wish to. He said, but no man is going to take her out of my jailhouse tonight. Drum Crale said, Sheriff. Caleb said, I am not finished. Drum Crale closed his mouth. Caleb said, Drum, your son is dead, and you are grieving, and I understand it. He said, I buried my own wife 8 years ago, and I know what grief is, and I am not going to lecture you about it on the night of your son's death. He said, but you are about to do a thing tonight that cannot be undone, and I am about to do a thing tonight that cannot be undone either. And before you and I do those things in front of each other, I am going to ask the men behind you to think for a minute about what kind of night this is going to be. He raised his voice slightly. He said, Hollis Brand. The blacksmith was in the 3rd row of the mob on Drum's right, with a length of axe handle in his hands and a torch he was sharing with another man. He looked up. Caleb said, Hollis. He said, I am asking you a question. I am asking you whether you remember the 2nd week of last December. He said, I am asking you whether you remember the deputy in this office who walked 4 miles up a dry creek in the snow at night and brought your daughter Marin home to you wrapped inside her own coat, and who refused the $20 you offered her the next morning, and who told you it was not the kind of work you paid for. Hollis Brand was looking at the muddy ground in front of his boots. He did not raise his eyes. Caleb said, Hollis, the woman who is sitting on the bench inside this jailhouse right now is the same woman who carried Marin out of those woods. He said, Are you here to hang her tonight, Hollis? Hollis Brand stood for a long moment without speaking. Then he turned, very slowly, and he handed his torch to the man beside him, and he handed his axe handle to the man on his other side, and he walked out of the mob and across the muddy street to the boardwalk in front of the dry goods shop, and he sat down on the bench against the wall, and he put his face in his hands. The mob stirred. Caleb said, Pete Morin. The teamster was in the 2nd row on the left side with a length of pipe in his right hand. He looked up. Caleb said, Pete. He said, Do you remember the spring of 1884? He said, Do you remember the night I came to your barn after Bert Holligan had filed the complaint, and how I looked at the harness and at the hoof marks in the soft ground around the back gate, and how I told Bert in the front office of this jailhouse the next morning that the evidence was insufficient to charge anyone with anything, and how Bert went home angry and the matter was dropped. He said, Pete, I knew. He said, I knew, and I did not write the report I could have written, and I did not bring you to charge because your wife had just had your 2nd child, and the harness had been a hard year, and Bert Holligan was a wealthy man with 2 more horses where that one had come from, and you were not. He said, Pete, I have not asked you for anything in 3.5 years. I am asking you tonight, Pete. I am asking you to walk away from this corner. Pete Morin did not look at him. He looked at his own boots. He said, in a voice that did not carry beyond the front rows, Sheriff, I am sorry, and he turned, and he walked back through the mob the way he had come and out the back of it and was gone. Caleb said, Ezra Vance. The deacon was at the back of the mob, in a long dark wool coat without a torch and without a weapon. And he had clearly come along on the trailing edge of the crowd in the way men of his profession sometimes did at moments like this, neither leading nor refusing, hoping perhaps to be useful in some unspecified later capacity. He stiffened when he heard his name. Caleb said, "Ezra." He said, "You have stood at 6 funerals in this town in the last 3 years, where my deputy and I dug the graves the morning before the service because the family could not afford to hire it done." He said, "2 of those graves were yours, Ezra, your sister, and your nephew, and you wept at both of them, and you thanked us afterward by the gate." He said, "Ezra, are you going to stand at the back of a lynching mob and pretend you came along to keep the peace?" He said, "You are not. You are going home." He said, "You are walking away from this corner now, and you are going to your house, and you are kneeling beside your bed for an hour, Ezra, and you are going to ask yourself whether the man you have been telling people you are on a Sunday is the same man who came up to my jailhouse on a Saturday with a mob of 30 other men." He said, "Go home, Ezra." The deacon turned without speaking and walked away. The mob stirred. There was now the beginning of the small particular sound that a crowd makes when it starts to come apart, which is the low cross-talk of men who had not been thinking until this moment, but who were beginning to think, and who were turning to look at the men beside them and behind them and to take small involuntary steps backward or sideways. Caleb did not stop. He said, "Jenny Wills." There was a small, surprised silence. The mob had not noticed Jenny Wills. She was at the back, in a dark gray shawl, and Caleb had seen her arrive 10 minutes earlier and had wondered, when he had seen her, whether she had come to spectate or to participate or for some third reason. He did not know. She stepped forward into the light of the torches. She was a thin woman of 40, with a hard, tired face and a dark gray shawl pulled tight against the cold. Caleb said, "Jenny," he said, "your husband Tom was killed in the collapse of the 3rd shaft of the Crale mine in the spring of 1885. He said, "My deputy and I dug Tom out of that shaft together." He said, "The rest of the men of cold iron stood at the head of the shaft and would not go down because they said it was unsafe, and they were right, it was unsafe, and my deputy and I went down anyway because Tom Wills was in there, and we did not know whether he was alive." He said, "When we got him out, Jenny, he was already gone." He said, "But my deputy carried him up out of that shaft in her own arms, Jenny, and the 2 of us walked him to your door. And you and I sat in your kitchen for the rest of that night, and Vrenna sat on your porch step." He said, "Jenny, why are you here?" Jenny Wills opened her mouth. She closed it again. She looked at Drum Crale, and then at Caleb, and then at the wooden steps of the jailhouse, and at the open door beyond him, through which she could see, dimly, the small, still figure of Vrenna sitting on the wooden bench inside. She said, in a voice that was not steady, "Drum Crale paid for the shaft Tom Wills was buried in." She said, "Sheriff, I owed him." Caleb said, "Jenny, you owe him a debt." He said, "Drum Crale paid for your husband's funeral and for half a year of your rent afterward, and I know that, and you know that, and Drum Crale knows that." He said, "But a debt is not the same thing as a rope, Jenny, and the man you owe the debt to is not asking you for the rope. He is asking you to stand in his crowd, and you do not have to do it." He said, "You do not have to do it, Jenny. Go home." Jenny Wills stood for a moment longer. Then she nodded once, very slightly, at Caleb, and she turned, and she walked back the way she had come. And she was gone. The mob was, by now, half its original size. 12 men had peeled off in the wake of the named, and another 4 or 5 had begun the small sideways drift of men who had not been named but who could feel which way the wind was now blowing. Caleb did not stop. He named 2 more. He named Thomas Hett, the saloon keeper of the Mountain Rose, who had come out at the last minute behind Drum Crale and who had a daughter. Vrenna had walked home one night from a porch where 2 drunk teamsters had been bothering her, and Thomas Hett walked away. He named Stuart Caro, who had been a deputy of Caleb's for 2 years before Vrenna, and whom Caleb had let go for drunkenness in a way that had allowed Stuart to keep his pension, and Stuart Caro walked away. By the time Caleb had finished naming the 6 men he had begun the night with, plus the 2 he had improvised, the mob in front of the jailhouse step was 11 men. Drum Crale and his 5 mine foremen at the front, and 3 drunk men on the periphery who had not yet decided whether they were leaving with the rest or staying to see what happened. The torches were down to 2. The rifles were down to 7. Caleb looked at Drum Crale. He said, "Drum." Drum Crale said, "Sheriff." There was a long silence between them. Caleb said, "Your son is dead, and your son is dead because he drew on a sworn officer of this town in a saloon full of witnesses, and you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives knowing this." He said, "But you are not going to take her tonight, Drum. You are not going to take her tomorrow. You are not going to take her ever." He said, "She is with me." He said it quietly. The phrase carried in the cold air to the back of the mob. He said, "She is with me, Drum, and the day you decide that any Orc deputy in any sheriff's office anywhere in the territory is the kind of person you can take out of a jailhouse and hang from an elm tree on a Saturday night, is the day you have decided that no peace officer of any kind in any town in this territory is safe in his own office, and you are not going to make that decision tonight." He said, "You are going home, Drum. You are going home, and you are sitting up with the body of your son, who is in the back of the undertaker's wagon at the corner of Silver, and you are going to hold his hand for the night, and you are going to bury him in the morning, and you are going to find me at this office at noon on Monday, and I am going to walk you through the deposition the territorial court is going to want from you in the matter of his death, and we are going to do this honestly and in the open and in the way it's supposed to be done." He said, "That is what is going to happen." Drum Crale stood at the foot of the steps for a very long moment. He looked up at Caleb, and Caleb saw the small particular crack run through his face that grief takes at the moment a man stops being able to fight it, and Drum Crale's eyes filled and overflowed, and he did not raise his hand to wipe them. He said, in a voice that was low and broken, "Sheriff, all right?" He turned. He walked through the parting of his 5 remaining men. He walked back down Main Street toward the corner of Silver and the undertaker's wagon, and his men, after a moment, came after him in a loose, unhappy column. And the 3 drunks on the periphery, seeing themselves alone, drifted off the boardwalk into the alleys. The street emptied. Caleb stood on the top step of the jailhouse with his rifle held muzzle down at his side and one hand resting on the wooden rail until the last of them was out of sight. Then he turned and went back inside. Vrenna was sitting on the wooden bench in the front office in the same position she had been sitting in when he had walked out, with her hat in her lap and her hands folded over the brim and her badge still pinned to the leather of her vest. She looked up at him. She said, "Sheriff." He said, "Vrenna." She said, "Did you get them all?" He said, "All but Drum." He said, "Drum will keep." He sat down on the bench beside her. He set the rifle across his own knees. He said, "Vrenna." She said, "What?" He said, "The thing I told them out there about you carrying Tom Wills out of the shaft and Marin Brand out of the woods and the rest of it." She said, "Yes." He said, "Vrenna, if I had told them only what was true and stopped there, half of them would have stayed." He said, "I told them what was true, but I told it in the order of the people they could not look in the face afterwards if they did not turn around tonight." He said, "That is not the same as telling the truth." She said, "Sheriff." He said, "What?" She said, "It is enough the same that I am going to sleep tonight." He laughed once dryly. They sat there for a long time. The trial of the matter of the death of Lonnie Crale was held in the Territorial Circuit Court at the Capitol 5 weeks later. The witnesses gave their evidence. The bartender Pell gave his evidence. The man Holbein gave his evidence and showed the long, shallow scar on the back of his right forearm. Drum Crale was present at the trial and did not contest the testimony of the witnesses, though he sat at the back of the courtroom every day with his 5 mine foremen behind him. Vrenna gave her evidence in her own steady voice from the witness chair. The court, which was presided over by an old territorial judge who had read the depositions in advance and had heard about the night at the jailhouse from the territorial marshal, who had heard about it from Caleb's correspondence, found that Lonnie Crale had drawn on a sworn officer in the lawful execution of her duty, and that the deputy had fired in lawful self-defense, and the matter was closed. Vrenna returned to Cold Iron with Caleb on the train. The town did not, in the years that followed, become a different town than it had been before that night. Drum Crale never spoke to Caleb again, and never came up to the jailhouse, and continued to operate his 3 mines until his death of a stroke in the spring of 1893. The men who had walked away from the mob that night were the same men they had been before it, with the addition that they now knew something about themselves they had not previously known, and they carried this knowledge in different ways for the rest of their lives. Hollis Brand began to come into the jailhouse every Friday afternoon for the next 12 years to bring Vrenna a small wrapped loaf of his wife's bread. Pete Morin never crossed Caleb's path in any official capacity again, and disappeared into the patient, honest life of a teamster, and his second son was named Caleb. Ezra Vance preached a sermon in the church in Cold Iron the Sunday morning following the night at the jailhouse on the text of Matthew chapter 25, verse 40, the substance of which most of his parishioners understood. Jenny Wills came to the back door of the jailhouse the following Tuesday with a small jar of the apple butter she had been putting up that autumn, and gave it to Vrenna at the door with no words exchanged between them. Caleb held the office of Sheriff of Cold Iron for another 7 years. He died in the small wooden house behind the jailhouse painted in Margaret's dark blue in the autumn of 1894, of a stroke in his sleep at the age of 71. Vrenna found him in the morning. She buried him beside Margaret in the small fenced cemetery on the hill behind the church. She wore his sheriff's star pinned beside her own deputy's star on the leather of her vest at the funeral, which the council of the town of Cold Iron had voted unanimously the previous afternoon would be the new arrangement of authority in the office. And she held the office of Sheriff of Cold Iron for the next 23 years. She did not, in those 23 years, ever again have to stand on the top step of the jailhouse with a rifle held muzzle down at her side and one hand on the wooden rail in front of a mob, because the town of Cold Iron having discovered on a Saturday night in 1887 what kind of town it was, did not require the lesson again. The carved wooden token she had worn around her neck on the day she rode into Cold Iron in 1881 was hung above the front desk in the sheriff's office on the morning of Caleb's funeral. On a small iron nail, Vrenna drove into the wood herself, and it remained there for the next 23 years, and after Vrenna's own death in 1917, it remained there for another 41 years, and the office of Sheriff of Cold Iron was held in those years by a succession of men and women, 4 of whom were of Vrenna's people, and the carved wooden token hung above the desk through every change of the office until the building burned down in a fire in 1958, after which it was lost. The town of Cold Iron is still there. The mine is closed. The elm tree at the foot of Silver Street is still standing. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like. It helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. The Orc Keeper